The day Augusta Lawson told the church ladies she wanted to read philosophy. They laughed so hard Mrs. Henderson nearly choked on her tea. It was 1883 in Coolidge, Arizona, where the summer heat baked the desert earth until it cracked like broken promises, and the dust storms rolled through with enough force to strip paint from buildings. Augusta stood in that parlor with her spine straight and her hands clasped, watching women twice her age dismiss her dreams as if they were nothing more than childish fantasies. Mrs. Patterson patted her hand with condescension dripping from every word, saying women had no need for education or books beyond the Bible, and perhaps a cookbook if they were feeling ambitious. Augusta was 19 years old, and she felt something inside her chest crack wider than the parched ground outside. She had grown up on a struggling farm 15 miles from town, the youngest of 6 children and the only one who had taught herself to read beyond basic primers. Her father had died when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise them alone with nothing but determination and the small crops they could coax from the unforgiving soil. Her brothers had scattered to find work, her sisters had married young, and Augusta had stayed to help her mother until last year when a fever took her too. The farm had been sold to pay debts, and Augusta had come to Coolidge with nothing but a carpetbag, her mother's wedding ring, and a fierce hunger to learn everything the world had kept from her. She found work at the general store, sweeping floors and organizing inventory for Mr. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who paid her fairly and never questioned why she lingered near the book section during slow hours, running her fingers along spines she could not afford to purchase. The town was small, sun-beaten, with wooden buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of the heat. Coolidge served as a supply stop for ranchers and a waypoint for travelers heading to bigger cities, its population barely scraping 200 souls, most of them men working the ranches that sprawled across the territory. The library in Coolidge consisted of 17 books in the back room of the church, available only on Sunday afternoons and only with the Reverend's approval. Augusta had been denied access 3 times. Apparently, a young, unmarried woman reading beyond her station was seen as dangerous, likely to fill her head with ideas that would make her unmarriageable. The irony was not lost on her that they considered ignorance a desirable trait in a wife. Kent Jackson rode into town on a Thursday afternoon when the sun sat heavy and merciless in a cloudless sky. His horse was a sturdy bay, well cared for and patient, and he himself was tall with sun-darkened skin and hands that showed both work and capability. He was 24, though his eyes carried the kind of steady calm that made him seem older. He owned a ranch 10 miles north, a property he had built from nothing over 5 years of backbreaking work. He was not wealthy, but he was solvent, which in this territory made him something of a success story. He came into the general store needing supplies, fence posts and nails, coffee and flour. Augusta was behind the counter, noting inventory in a ledger with handwriting that caught his attention immediately. It was precise and elegant, the letters formed with obvious care and practice. Most of the ranch hands and cowboys who came through could barely scratch an X for their signature. "You write a fine hand," he said, not meaning to speak the thought aloud. Augusta looked up, meeting his eyes with a directness that startled him. Her eyes were gray like storm clouds, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She was pretty in an understated way, the kind of beauty that came from strength rather than delicacy. "Thank you. I practice whenever I can. Not many folks around here care much for penmanship." "Not many folks around here care much for women learning penmanship," she replied, a edge of bitterness in her tone that she tried to soften, but could not quite manage. Kent paid for his supplies and found himself lingering, something he rarely did in town. He preferred the open range, the solitude of his ranch, the company of his horse and his dog over people. But something about her drew his curiosity. "You like to read?" "I love to read, or I would if anyone would let me near a decent book." He left that day with his supplies, and the memory of her voice, frustrated and defiant and hungry for something the town seemed determined to deny her. Kent had been raised by a father who believed education was the only real wealth a person could own. His father had been a teacher back in Ohio before consumption took him when Kent was 16. His mother had died in childbirth when he was 6. Before his father passed, he had made Kent promise to never stop learning, to never let the world make him small or ignorant. Kent had brought his father's entire library west with him, 73 books packed carefully in crates and transported across half the country at great expense and effort. They sat on shelves in his ranch house, the most valuable things he owned besides the land itself. He came back to the general store the following week, and the week after that. He began timing his supply runs to coincide with when Augusta worked, and they fell into conversations that stretched longer each time. She asked him about his ranch, about the work, about the land. He found himself talking more than he usually did, drawn out by her genuine interest. She had an incisive mind, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond the surface of things. One afternoon in late July, when the heat was so intense that the air seemed to shimmer and warp, Kent asked her if she would like to borrow a book. Augusta's hand stilled on the crate she was unpacking. "Borrow a book from where?" "From me. I have some at my ranch. My father was a teacher. I inherited his collection." The hope that flashed across her face was so raw it made his chest tighten. "You would let me borrow your books?" "I would, if you wanted." "What kind of books?" Her voice was careful, as if afraid to believe this was real. "All kinds. Literature, philosophy, history, science, some poetry, a few medical texts, whatever interests you." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for mockery or deception. Finding neither, she said quietly, "Why would you do that?" "Because you want to read them." "That seems reason enough to me." The first book he brought her the next week was a collection of Emerson's essays. She held it like it was made of gold and spun glass, her hands trembling slightly. "I will take such good care of this." "I know you will. Take your time with it." Augusta read that book in 4 days, staying up by candlelight in the small room she rented above the boarding house, rationing her candles and ignoring her exhaustion. She absorbed every word, every idea, feeling her mind expand and stretch in ways that were almost painful in their intensity. When she returned it to Kent, she had a dozen questions, thoughts about self-reliance and transcendentalism, and the individual's relationship to society. They stood outside the general store as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose, and talked for an hour while the town moved around them. Kent brought her another book, and then another. Over the late summer and into early fall, a pattern developed. He came to town every week, sometimes twice a week, always with a new book and always staying to talk about the last one she had read. Their conversations ranged widely, touching on philosophy and politics, on the nature of justice and freedom, on the question of what made a life meaningful. Augusta had spent so long starving for intellectual engagement that these talks felt like water in the desert. And Kent, who had lived in relative isolation since his father's death, found in her a companion whose mind challenged and delighted him. The town noticed, of course. By September, the gossip had reached the point where Mrs. Patterson made a point of cornering Augusta after Sunday service to tell her that spending so much time with Kent Jackson, unchaperoned and unmarried, was inappropriate and would ruin her reputation. Augusta listened with outward politeness and inward fury, thanked her for the concern, and continued exactly as before. What she could not tell Mrs. Patterson was that somewhere between Emerson and Thoreau, between discussions of Plato and debates about whether the frontier made men freer or just more lawless, she had fallen in love with Kent Jackson. It had happened gradually, then all at once. She loved the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened as if her thoughts mattered. She loved his dry humor, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. She loved that he treated her mind as valuable, that he never once suggested she should be content with less than she wanted. She loved his hands, scarred and capable, and the way he sat his horse and the quiet integrity that seemed to radiate from him. She did not tell him this. She was terrified that speaking it aloud would break the spell, that he would pull away, that she would lose both his friendship and the books. So she kept her feelings locked away and tried to be satisfied with what she had. Kent, for his part, was waging his own internal battle. He had fallen for her somewhere around the third or fourth book, when she had argued passionately about the ethics of civil disobedience, and he had realized he wanted to hear her opinions on everything for the rest of his life. He wanted to watch her rage, to see her face light up with new ideas. He wanted to build something with her, a life that would give her everything this narrow-minded town tried to deny her. But he was acutely aware that he was a rancher with a modest spread and no family connections, while she was young and brilliant and deserved more than a hard life on isolated land. So he held back, giving her books but not his heart, though it was a near thing every time he saw her. In October, the tensions came to a head. Reverend Morrison approached Kent after church and suggested, in tones that were not quite threatening but certainly unfriendly, that his frequent visits to see Miss Lawson were causing talk, and that perhaps it would be better for her reputation if he curtailed them. Kent listened in silence, his jaw tight, and then said with perfect civility that he appreciated the Reverend's concern but would continue to do as he pleased. The Reverend's face went red, and he sputtered something about propriety and moral standards. Kent touched his hat brim and walked away before he said something he would regret. He found Augusta at the boarding house. It was a Sunday afternoon, and she was sitting on the front porch with a book, one of his books, open in her lap. She looked up as he approached, and the smile that started on her face faded when she saw his expression. "What happened?" He sat down beside her, suddenly unsure how to begin. "The Reverend thinks I am compromising your reputation. He suggested I stop visiting you." Augusta closed the book carefully, her face unreadable. "I see, and what did you tell him?" "I told him I would continue to do as I pleased. But Augusta, I need to know, am I causing you trouble, real trouble? Because if I am, I will find another way to get you the books. I will not stop you from reading, but I will not be the reason this town makes your life harder." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dusty street. Then she said, "They have been making my life harder since the day I asked for something more than they thought I deserved." "You are not the problem, Kent. You are the only person in this entire territory who treats me like my mind matters, like I am more than just a potential wife and mother. Do you know what that means to me? I think I am beginning to understand. Then do not stop coming. I do not care what they say." He turned to look at her, this fierce, brilliant woman who refused to be made small. "Augusta, I need to tell you something." She met his eyes, and he saw apprehension there, mixed with something that might have been hope. "I did not start bringing you books out of pure altruism. I mean, I believed you should have access to them, but that is not the only reason I kept coming back." Her breath caught. "Why did you keep coming back?" Because I am in love with you. I have been for months. I love your mind and your spirit, and your refusal to accept the limitations they try to place on you. I love talking to you more than I have ever enjoyed anything. I love the way you argue with philosophers who have been dead for centuries. The way you get so absorbed in a book you forget to eat. The way you look at the world and refuse to settle for what is when you can see what could be. Augusta felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelming relief and joy flooding through her. I am in love with you too. I have been trying so hard not to be, trying not to hope for this, but I am. Completely. Kent reached for her hand and she gave it to him, their fingers intertwining. I do not have much to offer you. A ranch that barely turns a profit, a house that needs work, a life that will be hard more often than it is easy. But I can promise you that you will never lack for books, that I will never try to make you less than you are, and that I will love you for as long as I live. That is everything I want, she said, and meant it with her whole heart. He kissed her there on the porch of the boarding house, in full view of anyone who cared to look, and neither of them gave a damn about the scandal. When they pulled apart, Augusta was smiling wider than Kent had ever seen, her eyes bright with tears and joy. Marry me, he said. Please. I know it is fast, but I have never been more certain of anything. Yes. Yes, of course yes. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony that most of the town's respectable citizens declined to attend, citing various excuses that fooled no one. Mr. Chen came, and a few of the ranch hands who worked neighboring properties and knew Kent to be a good man. The Reverend performed the ceremony with obvious disapproval, and Augusta could not have cared less. She wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, pale blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers Kent had picked that morning. When he slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his grandmother's, she felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. They rode to the ranch that afternoon, Augusta seated in front of Kent on his horse, her carpetbag tied behind the saddle. The land stretched out endlessly around them, scrub, brush, and cacti, distant mountains purple against the horizon. The ranch house was modest, rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney, 2 rooms that Kent had built himself over the course of several months. It was clean and well-maintained, furnished sparsely with practical pieces. And then Kent showed her the books. They lined shelves he had built along 2 walls of the main room, 73 volumes in various states of wear, their spines showing titles that made Augusta's heart race. Philosophy and poetry, history and science, novels and essays. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of having access to, a treasure beyond any monetary wealth. These are yours now too, Kent said, watching her face. Read any of them whenever you want, all of them. Take your time or devour them quickly, whatever suits you. They belong to both of us now. Augusta turned to him with tears streaming down her face. I cannot believe this is real. I cannot believe you are real. I am very real, and this is your home now, our home. They settled into married life with surprising ease. The work was hard, as Kent had promised. Augusta learned to help with the ranch, tending the small garden Kent had planted, helping to mend fences, learning to handle the horses. Her hands, which had been soft despite her work at the general store, developed calluses and scratches. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to manage their meager finances, to stretch supplies when money was tight. But she also read, every evening and on quiet afternoons, working her way through Kent's library with systematic thoroughness. And they talked, endlessly about everything and nothing, finding in each other the intellectual partnership neither had thought possible. The first months of marriage revealed depths to Kent that Augusta had only glimpsed before. He was patient and thoughtful, quick to listen and slow to judge. He had a talent for understanding the land, for knowing when to plant and when to harvest, for reading weather patterns and animal behavior. He taught her about the desert, pointing out plants that could be eaten and ones that could kill, showing her how to track rabbits and where to find water in dry seasons. And in the quiet intimacy of their evenings, he showed her a tenderness that made her feel cherished in ways she had never experienced. But as winter approached, Augusta began to notice something that troubled her. Kent would often grow quiet when she talked about the books she was reading, particularly the philosophy and political theory. At first, she thought he was tired or distracted by ranch concerns. Then one evening in December, as they sat by the fire and she excitedly explained a concept from Mills on Liberty, he interrupted her. "Augusta, do you ever regret this? Marrying me, living out here, being cut off from a broader world?" She set down her book, startled. "No, never." "Why would you ask that?" "Because you are brilliant. You should be in a university, studying with professors, debating with other students. Instead, you are stuck on a ranch in the middle of nowhere with a man who barely finished secondary school. Kent Jackson, you are one of the most educated people I have ever met. You have read more than most university graduates will in a lifetime, and I am not stuck here. I chose this. I chose you. But what about your dreams? You wanted education, access to learning. I can give you books, but I cannot give you teachers or peers or recognition for your intellect." Augusta moved to sit beside him, taking his hands in hers. "My dream was never about universities or recognition. It was about being allowed to learn, to grow, to think freely. This town, those people, they wanted to keep me small and ignorant because I was born a woman. You are giving me the opposite of that. You are giving me freedom, Kent. The freedom to read and learn and become whoever I am meant to be. That is everything. But is it enough? Will it always be enough?" She kissed him softly. "It is more than enough. You are more than enough. I love you and I love this life we are building. Please believe that." He held her close, wanting desperately to believe, and gradually the fear that he was failing her eased. But something had been planted in his mind, a seed of an idea that would grow over the coming months. Winter in the Arizona desert was not like winters in the north, but it had its own hardness. The nights grew cold enough to require heavy blankets and careful tending of the fire. They lost 2 cattle to illness, a financial blow that meant tightening already tight belts. Kent took on extra work where he could find it, helping neighboring ranches with various tasks, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. Augusta managed the property in his absence, learning through trial and error and occasional help from their nearest neighbor, an older widow named Mrs. Torres, who lived 5 miles east and appreciated having another woman relatively nearby. In January, Augusta realized she was pregnant. The signs were subtle at first, then unmistakable. She told Kent on a cold, clear night, watching his face transform from confusion to understanding to overwhelming joy. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight, before setting her down carefully as if she had suddenly become fragile. "We are going to be parents," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are. Are you ready for that? I have no idea, but I am so happy I could burst." They spent the evening making plans, discussing names and futures, imagining the child they would raise together. And Kent thought again about the idea that had been growing in his mind, the project he had been planning in secret. He had been saving money, carefully and quietly, setting aside every spare penny. He had been making plans, drawing sketches, calculating costs. And now, with a child coming, the need felt even more urgent. Spring arrived with wildflowers painting the desert in unexpected colors. Augusta's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she tired more easily and had to reduce her physical work around the ranch. She spent more time reading, but found herself frustrated by the limitations of the collection. She had read most of the books now, some of them multiple times. She craved new material, new ideas, fresh perspectives. Kent noticed her frustration, though she tried to hide it, and in late April he began his project in earnest. He had a small amount of savings from years of careful management and the extra work he had taken on over the winter. He ordered lumber from Tucson, a significant expense that required borrowing against next year's cattle sales. When the wagon arrived with the supplies, Augusta asked what he was planning. "A surprise," he said. "Trust me," she trusted him. He began building in early May, working on it every spare moment he could find. He built onto the house, extending one wall to create a new room. It was hard work, made harder by the heat that returned with vengeance as summer approached. He worked in the early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the worst of the sun. Mrs. Torres came by and watched with obvious curiosity, but Kent politely deflected her questions. Augusta was not allowed to help or to see inside until it was finished. It took him 6 weeks. The construction was rough in places, the work of an amateur carpenter rather than a professional, but it was solid and true. The room was 12 feet by 12 feet, with 2 windows that let in light and air. And then came the part that had required the most planning and expense. He had written to booksellers in San Francisco and Denver, carefully selecting titles based on what Augusta had mentioned wanting to read. He spent money they could not really afford to spend, buying 42 new books. They arrived in crates over the course of several weeks, and he hid them until the room was ready. Then he built shelves, lots of shelves, lining 3 walls of the new room with places for books. He sanded them smooth so there would be no splinters to damage precious pages. He built a desk and a chair near one window, a place where Augusta could sit and read and write in good light. He made a small bookcase specifically for medical texts and parenting books, something they would need with a child coming. And on a warm evening in mid-June, when everything was finally ready, he led Augusta outside and around to the new room, covering her eyes with his hands as they approached. "Kent, what have you done? Just wait. Okay, you can look now." She opened her eyes and saw the new room, saw the door with its simple latch. Kent opened it and gestured for her to enter. Augusta stepped inside and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The room was filled with books. The shelves held not just Kent's original collection, which he had moved from the main room, but dozens of new volumes. Shakespeare and Dickens, Darwin and Newton, Bront sisters and Austen, Homer and Virgil, contemporary novels and ancient histories. There were books on medicine and botany, astronomy and mathematics. There was a beautiful edition of poetry by Whitman, and collected works of Poe, and volumes on political theory she had only dreamed of reading. "This is your library," Kent said quietly, standing in the doorway. "I know it is not a university, and I know it is not a grand library in a city somewhere, but it is yours, a place where you can read and study and learn anything you want. No one will ever tell you that you have no need for education or books, not here, not in our home." Augusta could not speak. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the shelves filled with knowledge, the desk where she could write, the windows that looked out over the land they were building a life on. Tears streamed down her face and she pressed her hands to her mouth, overwhelmed. Kent stepped forward, worried. "Is it all right? I know it is not perfect, the carpentry is rough, and I probably spent too much on the books, but I wanted you to have this. I wanted you to have everything you were denied for so long." She turned to him and threw her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as she could manage with her growing belly between them. "It is perfect, It is the most perfect thing anyone has ever done for me. Kent, I do not have words for what this means. You built me a library. You built me a library in our home." He held her, feeling the way she shook with the force of her emotions. "You deserve this and so much more. You deserve every book ever written and every thought ever conceived. I cannot give you all of that, but I can give you this. A place that is yours, where you can be exactly who you are meant to be." They stood there together in the library he had built for her, in the home they had made together, and Augusta felt a happiness so complete it was almost painful. This man, this beautiful, thoughtful man, had seen her for who she truly was and had moved heaven and earth to give her what she needed. Not what society said she should want, not what would make her acceptable to narrow-minded people, but what would feed her soul and her mind. That night they lay in bed with the windows open to let in the cooler air, and Augusta said, "I want our daughter to grow up knowing she can learn anything she wants to learn." Our daughter. You think it is a girl. I do. I cannot explain why, but I do. And I want her to have access to that library from the moment she can read. I want her to know that her mind is valuable, that her thoughts matter, that she is limited only by her own ambition and not by what anyone tells her she should be. And if it is a boy, then I want him to grow up respecting women's minds as much as men's, seeing his mother as an intellectual equal to his father, learning that strength comes in many forms. Kent kissed her forehead. Either way, our children will be raised to value knowledge and respect all people. I promise you that. The summer passed in a haze of heat and new books. Augusta spent hours in her library, devouring the volumes Kent had purchased, filling pages of a journal with her thoughts and reactions. She was reading Origin of Species when her water broke on a sweltering afternoon in August. Kent had been working on the fence line and came running when she called, finding her standing in the doorway of the library, book still in hand, looking determined and terrified in equal measure. Mrs. Torres came to help with the birth, experienced and calm, talking Augusta through the long hours of labor. Kent paced and worried and felt utterly useless until finally, as the sun set and the heat of the day began to fade, a baby's cry filled the house. He was allowed in to find Augusta exhausted and glowing, holding a tiny, red-faced infant. "A boy," Mrs. Torres announced with satisfaction. "Healthy lungs on this one." Kent sat beside the bed, staring at his son with awe. "He is perfect." "He is," Augusta agreed, running her finger gently over the baby's small hand. "I was wrong about having a girl, but I am not sorry. Hello, little one. Welcome to your home." They named him after Kent's father, Samuel Jackson, and called him Sam. He was a good baby, healthy and curious from the start. Augusta recovered well from the birth, and by September she was back to her routine, though now she read with Sam sleeping in a basket beside her desk or nestled against her shoulder. Kent would come in from the day's work to find her in the library, reading aloud from whatever book she was on, Sam apparently absorbing the words even though he could not possibly understand them yet. The town continued to disapprove of them, a disapproval that had only intensified when Augusta appeared visibly pregnant, without having shown proper contrition for her unconventional marriage. But they had each other, and their son, and the library that stood as testament to the fact that love could be expressed not just in words but in actions, in the building of shelves and the purchasing of books, in the recognition of someone's deepest needs and the determination to meet them. When winter came again, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Kent worked the ranch, Augusta managed the house and cared for Sam, and in the evenings they read together, taking turns reading aloud while the other held the baby. Sometimes Kent would read to her from books she had already finished, wanting to discuss them with her. Sometimes she would read to him from new volumes, sharing discoveries and insights. And sometimes they would simply sit in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own book while Sam slept between them. In February of 1885, Augusta discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news came with less surprise and no less joy. Sam was 6 months old, a happy baby who smiled easily and seemed fascinated by everything around him. Kent worried that 2 children so close in age would be overwhelming, but Augusta was confident they would manage. "We have love and books in this good land," she said. "That is more than enough to raise a family on." The second pregnancy was harder than the first. Augusta was more tired, more uncomfortable, dealing with an active baby while her body changed. Kent took on as much of the housework as he could manage alongside ranch duties, and Mrs. Torres came by more frequently to help. But Augusta never complained, and she never stopped reading. The library had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the discomforts of pregnancy and the demands of motherhood for an hour and exist purely as herself, a mind engaged with ideas. Their daughter was born on a cool morning in October, arriving faster than Sam had, as if impatient to enter the world. Kent delivered her himself with Mrs. Torres coaching him through it, and when he placed the baby in Augusta's arms, he saw tears of joy streaming down his wife's face. "A daughter," Augusta whispered. "We have a daughter." They named her Clara Louise Jackson after Augusta's mother. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and she cried with impressive volume when displeased. Sam, now a year old and walking unsteadily, was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to touch her constantly with his small, clumsy hands. Life with 2 babies was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Kent and Augusta moved through their days in a blur of feedings and diaper changes, snatching sleep when they could and supporting each other through the difficult moments. But they also found joy in small things, in Sam's first words and Clara's first smile, in watching their children grow and thrive in the home they had built. As the children grew, the library became a central part of family life. Sam learned his letters sitting on Kent's lap at the desk, tracing them with his small finger while Kent praised his efforts. Clara proved to have her mother's voracious appetite for stories, demanding books even before she could read them herself. Augusta would sit with both children in the library, Clara on one knee and Sam pressed against her side, reading to them for hours. Fairy tales and fables at first, then simple chapter books, then increasingly complex stories as they grew. The town's attitude toward the Jackson family remained complicated. They were respected for their work ethic and the success of their ranch, which had grown modestly but steadily. Kent was known as a fair man who kept his word and paid his debts. Augusta was acknowledged to be a devoted mother and capable homemaker. But there remained an undercurrent of disapproval, a sense that they were somehow not quite proper, that Augusta was too educated and too opinionated, that Kent indulged her inappropriately. The fact that their children, especially Clara, were being taught to read and think critically was seen as potentially dangerous. Augusta did not care. She had long since stopped seeking the approval of people who believed ignorance was a virtue. She raised her children with love and intelligence, teaching them to question and explore, to read widely and think deeply. She continued her own education through the library Kent had built, working her way through advanced philosophy and science, writing long essays in her journals that no one but Kent would ever read, but that satisfied her need for intellectual expression. When Sam was 5 and Clara was 4, Kent expanded the library again, building more shelves to accommodate the books he continued to purchase whenever they had spare money. The collection had grown to over 200 volumes, making it one of the largest private libraries in the territory. Kent had also begun acquiring books specifically for the children, creating a section of the library dedicated to younger readers. On Clara's 4th birthday, Augusta gave her daughter a gift that made the little girl's eyes light up with joy, a beautiful illustrated edition of fairy tales that Augusta had been saving for months to purchase. They sat together in the library that evening, Clara in her mother's lap, slowly working through the first story. Clara could recognize some words now, and she read them aloud with pride while Augusta helped with the harder ones. "Mama, will I be able to read all the books in here someday?" Clara asked, looking around at the shelves. "If you want to, yes. You can read any book you want whenever you are ready for it." Mrs. Patterson said girls do not need to read big books. She said we only need to read recipes and the Bible. Augusta felt a familiar anger flare but kept her voice calm. "Mrs. Patterson is wrong. Girls can read anything boys can read. Your mind is just as good and just as important as any boy's mind. Do you understand that?" Clara nodded seriously. "I understand. Papa says you are the smartest person he knows. Papa is very kind. But smart is not as important as curious. As long as you stay curious, as long as you want to learn and grow, you will do wonderful things." Sam, listening from where he was looking at pictures in another book, piped up, "I want to be smart like Mama too." Kent, standing in the doorway, smiled. "You both will be. You will be whatever you want to be because your mother and I will make sure you have every opportunity to learn and grow." The years passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life. There were good years and bad years, seasons of plenty and seasons of scarcity. They had another child, a boy they named Thomas, and then a final daughter, Elizabeth. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, and the library expanded with it, the collection growing to over 300 books. Sam proved to be naturally gifted with animals and the land, learning ranching from his father with enthusiasm and skill. But he also loved history and biography, spending hours reading about explorers and pioneers. Clara was as voracious a reader as her mother had been, devouring everything from poetry to science, showing a particular aptitude for mathematics that surprised and delighted both parents. Thomas was quieter, more introspective, drawn to literature and philosophy. Elizabeth, the youngest, had her father's calm temperament and her mother's fierce independence, and she announced at age 5 that she intended to be a doctor when she grew up. The town of Coolidge grew slowly over the years, adding new buildings and new families. The attitudes toward education began to shift gradually, influenced in small part by the obvious success and happiness of the Jackson family. When Sam was 12, a proper school was established in town, and all 4 Jackson children attended, their academic abilities making them stand out among their peers. Clara, in particular, became something of a legend, regularly outperforming boys 3 and 4 years older in mathematics competitions. Augusta, now in her mid-30s, had grown into a woman of quiet confidence and deep contentment. The hunger that had driven her in youth had been satisfied not by grand achievements or public recognition, but by the life she had built with Kent. She had her library, her books, her children who knew that learning was valuable, and minds were not limited by gender. She had a husband who loved her as an equal and a partner, who had literally built her dreams into reality. One evening in the spring of 1895, when Sam was nearly 17 and little Elizabeth was just 6, the whole family gathered in the library. It had become tradition on Sunday evenings to spend time there together, each person reading or working on their own projects while sharing the comfortable space. Sam was reading a book on animal husbandry, preparing to take on more responsibility for the ranch. Clara, now nearly 16, was working through a complex algebra problem, her brow furrowed in concentration. Thomas, 12, was lost in a novel. Elizabeth was practicing her writing, forming careful letters on a slate. Kent was reviewing accounts, and Augusta was reading a new book on educational theory that had just arrived from San Francisco. Looking around at her family, at the shelves of books that lined the walls, at the children who had been raised to value knowledge and question authority, Augusta felt a profound sense of gratitude. The church ladies had been wrong. Women did need education and books, desperately and fundamentally. And this cowboy, this beautiful, thoughtful man who had seen her worth when no one else would, had built her a library to prove it. Kent looked up from his accounts and caught her eye, and the smile they shared held years of love and partnership and mutual respect. No words were needed. They had built something remarkable together, not just a physical structure of wood and shelves, but a family culture that valued learning and growth, that rejected the limitations society tried to impose, that believed in the fundamental equality of all minds. Clara solved her problem and looked up with triumph. "I got it. Mama, do you want to see?" "Always," Augusta said, moving to look over her daughter's shoulder at the elegant mathematical solution. Sam glanced up from his book. "Papa, do you have time tomorrow to show me that new fencing technique?" "First thing in the morning," Kent promised. Thomas read a passage aloud from his novel that he found particularly beautiful, and the family paused to listen and discuss it. Elizabeth showed off her improving handwriting, earning praise from everyone. And in that moment, in that room filled with books and love, and the certain knowledge that learning was a lifelong gift, the Jackson family was perfectly, completely happy. The library Kent had built continued to grow over the years, eventually holding over 500 volumes. It became known throughout the territory, and people would sometimes ride for hours just to borrow a book from the Jacksons' collection. Kent and Augusta never refused anyone who genuinely wanted to learn, male or female, young or old. The library became a quiet revolution, proving that knowledge was not the province of cities and universities alone, that a ranch house in the Arizona desert could hold as much wisdom and learning as any institution. Sam eventually took over the ranch, running it with his father's integrity and his mother's intelligence. He married a schoolteacher who loved the library as much as he did, and they raised their children surrounded by books. Clara went to university in California, one of the first women to study advanced mathematics there. But she always came home to the library where she had first learned to love learning. Thomas became a writer, publishing novels that drew on the philosophy and literature he had absorbed from those shelves. And Elizabeth did become a doctor, returning to Arizona to serve the rural communities that had so few medical services, her medical education beginning with the texts in her parents' library. Kent and Augusta grew old together, their hair graying and their faces weathering like the desert landscape they had made their home. But their love never diminished, and their partnership never wavered. They still spent evenings in the library, reading together, discussing ideas, sharing the intellectual companionship that had first drawn them together. The library had become the physical manifestation of their love, a structure built not of grand gestures or empty words, but of recognition and respect, of seeing what someone needed and building it with your own hands. On a warm evening in the summer of 1910, when Kent was 51 and Augusta 46, they sat together in the library as the sun set through the windows. Their children were grown and scattered but visited often. The shelves held over 600 books now, a collection built over decades of careful selection and precious resources devoted to learning. Augusta was reading a new work of philosophy, and Kent was reading a novel Thomas had sent them, his son's third published book. Augusta set down her book and looked at Kent. "Do you remember the day we met? I was so angry at the world. You had every right to be. They tried to keep you from what you needed most. And you gave it to me. All of this whole life, started because you believed I deserved to read." Kent reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as they had 30 years ago. "You deserved so much more than that. You deserved everything. I just gave you what I could. You gave me everything that matters. This library, these books, but more than that. You gave me partnership and respect and love. You gave me children who know that their minds are valuable. You gave me a life where I could be fully myself. There is no greater gift than that. You gave me the same. A life worth living, a purpose beyond just surviving. You made me better than I was." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands, surrounded by the books that had been their companions through decades of life. Outside, the desert stretched away under a sky turning purple and gold, the same sky that had witnessed their first meeting, their wedding, the birth of their children, all the small moments that had built into a lifetime. "I love you," Augusta said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you. Always have, always will." Years later, when Kent passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67, surrounded by family, the library stood as his legacy. Augusta lived another 8 years, spending her days among the books he had collected for her, adding to the collection when she could, sharing it freely with anyone who wanted to learn. When she died at 74, the library held over 700 volumes, and her children ensured it would remain intact, a family treasure and a community resource. The library in the Jackson home became legendary in Arizona, a symbol of what love looked like when it recognized and honored someone's deepest self. People told the story for generations, about the cowboy who had built his wife a library because they said women had no need for education or books, and he had believed differently. It was a story about love, yes, but also about respect and recognition, about seeing someone truly and building them a world where they could flourish. And in that library, on shelves built by Kent's hands and filled by their shared passion for learning, the books waited patiently for the next reader, the next mind hungry for knowledge, the next person who needed to know that learning was not a luxury, but a fundamental human need. The shelves stood as testament to a love that had built something lasting, something that would outlive them both, something that would continue to change lives long after they were gone. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would grow up surrounded by those books, would learn to read from volumes carefully preserved across decades, would understand that education was a right worth fighting for, and love was action as much as feeling. And somewhere in the dry Arizona air, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear Augusta's voice reading aloud, sharing knowledge with anyone willing to learn, her fierce spirit living on in every book opened, every mind expanded, every barrier broken down. The library Kent built for Augusta became more than just a room full of books. It became proof that one person, seeing clearly and loving fully, could change the world for someone else. It became a beacon for everyone who had ever been told they were not worthy of learning, not deserving of knowledge, not capable of great thoughts. It stood as evidence that they had been wrong, that women did need education and books, that minds should never be limited by the accidents of gender or birth or circumstance. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind moved through the spaces between the books, When the last light of day touched the spines arranged so carefully on those hand-built shelves, you could feel the love that had created this place. Not a selfish love or a possessive love, but a love that saw someone suffering from limitations placed on them unjustly and said, "I will build you something better. I will give you the tools to become everything you are meant to be. I will fight for your right to learn and grow and think and be." That was the legacy Kent and Augusta left behind. Not wealth or fame or public recognition, but a library in a ranch house, built by love and filled with the promise that anyone, regardless of who they were or what the world told them, could reach for knowledge and find it waiting, patient and welcoming, ready to transform their life. And in that promise, in those books, in the love that had built the shelves that held them, the story continued generation after generation, proving that some gifts echo forward through time, changing the world one mind at a time, one book at a time, one act of recognition and respect at a time. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the same colors that had witnessed the beginning of this love story. And in the library, the books waited, ready for the next reader, the next dreamer, the next person who needed to know that they were worthy of all the knowledge the world had to offer. The shelves Kent built stood strong. The books Augusta loved remained preserved, and the love they had shared lived on in every page turned, every lesson learned, every mind set free to explore and question and grow. They had built something that would last forever, not in stone or monument, but in the quiet revolution of a woman allowed to read, a family raised to value learning, and a cowboy who had loved enough to build a library where the world said one was not needed. And that, in the end, was everything.